to put that water one in there for you, Max. We know you appreciate good drinking water. Well, we are excited to be with you today, and I appreciate, one, the opportunity to present with the legend. We call him the legend up in Region 1, Jim Buchanan. If you haven't had a chance to rub shoulders with this good man, you need to. Whether you're new or old, you need to know Jim Buchanan. Next, we are cognizant of it. It's been a long day, and you've learned a lot. We will do our best to both hopefully keep you interactive with us, as well as if you have questions along the way, please feel free to interact with us as we go. We're going to talk specifically to emergency managers. Our goal today is to accomplish a few things with you. One, we hope that as you began your role in emergency management, and especially if you're an emergency manager, you've started to develop some habits. Whether you know them or not, or understand it or not, you're developing habits. And our goal with our presentation is to both tell you about a good initiative that we're excited to partner with the state, the Division of Emergency Management about, as well as hopefully today, by the time you're through, we'll give you some good things to take back that you can both work on and think deeply about your individual programs about. Two, we hope that, once more, there are some tools out there. We're going to talk about the Emergency Manager's Toolbox. And I hope as a practicing professional, you've got an Emergency Manager Toolbox. Whether you know it or not, it may be imaginary or it may be real, but we hope you have an emergency manager's toolbox because you are considered professional, and every profession out there has tools of the trade and needs to know how to use those tools. And we'll talk about those tools today, which hopefully will help us be better emergency managers. Certainly, next, once more, whether you're new or old, you either have or are developing a set of actions or plays that when the disaster strikes, you can put into use to help solve the problem. Hopefully, once more, they are good and you know how to apply them, use them. If not, once more, through the initiative that we'd like to discuss with you today, we'd like to, as a state, develop those good standard actions that we can all both practice and put into use when the disaster occurs. And then last but not least, practice makes perfect. We're firm believers in the 8 Ps, quoted by Miss Amanda Ripley in her book, practical, purpose, hold on, I gotta quote this right. The 8 Ps. Proper prior planning and preparation prevents piss poor performance. Sorry about a little derogatory there, but 8 Ps. And we are firm believers in that as we've participated in emergency management over the years. Being able to, one, be considered competent by your peers, those on your emergency management team, or those in your organization that interact with you is very critical. The goal to getting invited back for the next disaster is to appear competent and be able to accomplish a good job. I promise you, if you don't accomplish that, they aren't going to want to have you back. So hopefully today, with a little bit of practice too, and in the future with a lot more opportunities to practice, we can turn Utah emergency managers into professionals. So, off we go. Whether you're new or you're old, welcome to the field of emergency management. Of all the associations I've had an opportunity to be a part of, the Utah Emergency Management Association is by far the most diverse group of individuals in any association I've ever been a part of. As the treasurer, I've had an opportunity to keep track both of memberships and the money. Usually a little bit better at the membership than the money, but I want you to know, as an association, an emergency management association, we are probably the most diverse population you'll ever run into. Last week in the state of Utah, down in St. George, there was the Utah State Fire Chiefs Conference. And out of the 400 plus individuals that were in attendance at that conference, do you know how many individuals there were from law enforcement? I could count them all on 2 fingers. Do you know how many individuals went to that conference from Public Works? I only have to use 1 finger, But in the Emergency Management Association, we have individuals from just about every walk of life that you can think of, both government and non-government, private sector, just about every type of private sector you can think of. We are a very diverse group. And how does one build professionalism or a certification program for such a diverse group and come out with some standards or standard actions that would be considered by all the rest as being both competent and professional? What a unique challenge. And so both as an association and as a state program, the state of Utah has attempted to do that, and I think they've done a really good job over these years. As a profession, emergency management, how long has emergency management been around as a profession? Anybody care to venture a guess? Go ahead, Max.
40 years.
40 years. Well, why do you say 40 years?
Because they came around after I did.
Okay. Yeah, as I've posed that question to various people, that is a good one. In fact, most people, if you say where did emergency management as a profession begin, most of it in the United States began with the federal regulations, the Stafford Act. Initially it was civil defense, but 40 years, even though to the average person, Max, you're still very young, even 40 years to the average person may seem like a long time, but compared to other professions, we are still infants. I'm going to pick on Chief Ward back here. Chief Ward, how long has the fire service been a profession?
Depends on how far back you want to go.
Yeah. How far back in the United States?
Back up to Benjamin Franklin and the organized fire service. Volunteer company.
Okay. Yeah, a couple centuries, right? A couple, 200, 250 years, easy. Yeah. Law enforcement, who's here from law enforcement? Where did the law enforcement profession begin? Anybody wearing a gun and want to freely admit it? But yeah, similar to the fire service, the law enforcement profession has been around for hundreds of years. And so based on these other industries, once more, the term emergency manager and emergency management is relatively brand new. And so if there seems to be confusion, or if your peers in those other industries scratch their head when you arrive on scene saying, now, what's your job? Or who are you and what are you going to do? Don't be offended, because even our peers are learning who we are and what we can do. And it's our hope with this initiative to not only help ourselves as an organization, but to help our peers understand why having an emergency manager on a disaster scene is a good thing. And hopefully we will get invited back to a lot of different things. But enjoy your uniqueness, but just because you're unique doesn't always make us useful. Our goal is to become more useful. And once more, when we arrive on scene, we do have various options and choices that we can make in emergency management. Unfortunately, even with all the different types of disasters out there, There's not always a right or wrong answer. Once more, the profession is still new. There's science that is beginning to emerge, and people are starting to analyze people's actions and the consequences of those actions in a lot of different disasters, but there is not a nationwide and certainly not an international absolute set of initial actions for an emergency manager on the scene of a disaster. Many of you have probably taken more FEMA classes than you ever would care to admit or want to. Let me ask you this question. Of all the FEMA classes you've ever taken, how many of them ever addressed the first initial actions of the emergency manager on scene of a disaster? I'll buy dinner to anybody that can tell me one. Even with the hundreds, or literally now you get on the independent study, there's 1,000 of them there. There's not a single one devoted to initial actions of an emergency manager. And so, once more, as a profession, we are left trying to figure it out on our own. Our goal with both the project we're proposing to work on with the state of Utah, as well as with the association, is to do just that, is to come up with a set of standard guidelines and actions that we can do as emergency managers that will bring, hopefully, professionalism and standardization to our profession. Like our friend here, once more, many times we find ourselves in the middle of a bad situation and trying to figure out, how do I get out, or what do I do next? Whether it's this situation or any other disaster out there, eventually if we did nothing, what's going to happen? Will it come to a conclusion? It will. If I'll go back to the fire service. If we arrive on scene at a fire and don't put a single drop of water on that fire, eventually it'll go out on its own, right? Yeah. So what good is the fire department? Our goal in the fire service is to bring a much favorable conclusion to that fire and to prevent additional loss. Similarly, in the emergency management profession, we have a similar role: to arrive on scene, to apply our tools of the trade to bring a much quicker and better conclusion to that disaster than just letting it go on its own. In fact, just the opposite. If you ever find yourself on the scene of a disaster and you can't answer that question in the affirmative with, whatever I'm going to do is going to make it better, you have no business as an emergency manager being on that scene. If you can't make it better, don't make it worse. Okay? That's our goal. So often we are left with quite a few choices. One of the toughest we face, like our peers in law enforcement, public works, and in the fire service, we have to make chaos into order. If you've ever wondered what chaos looks like, there's actually a picture hanging in the National Archive. I can't even pronounce this guy's name. Zhang Biao, anyway, from China. His picture of chaos hangs in the National Archive. If you ever want to know what chaos looks like, there is, according to what the historians believe, chaos looks like. Our goal in emergency management is twofold. With good initial actions, once more, to start resolving and turning that chaos into something good, to prevent additional loss of life or loss of property, and to start making the situation better. And the quicker we can do it, the better and more effective we will be. And so having tools, knowing when to use those tools or how to apply those tools to the situation, hopefully as an emergency manager, will allow us to do just that.
A lot of times in that first initial response, when we show up as emergency managers to the scene or to the EOC, we lock ourselves into a predicament where we become paralyzed. We don't know what we're going to do. We don't know what actions we need to take. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending upon how you look at it, and we have to be careful because I don't want to upset Chris before he goes home and eats, we don't have enough emergencies to really lock in to our memory how to respond. If we had them as California and Florida and places like that where they were a common occurrence, I know every spring I'm going to do this and every fall I'm going to do this, we would begin building that memory, we would lock those actions in. We don't have it. It may be 10 years between events that you get called to, or some of you longer. And it's that paralysis that locks us into, where do I go, what do I do? The greater the anxiety, the greater the mind will leave us wanting. And so we're proposing with this program, you'll have to fix that. I'm not the computer guru in this operation. I'm still back to taking them off the overhead projector type thing. We need to become proficient. What you're seeing today is just an overview of what we have proposed to Director Hamlin and his staff of putting together a 2 or 3 hour block of programs where we will actually go through this, but we will then give you scenarios in various roles so that you can become familiar with making those initial decisions as to what you do as an emergency manager. As you've seen in some of your handouts, there's some job aids and some cheat sheets that will help us. But you're part of the team. I like to refer to when I was working that I was a ringmaster. And we go back to Will's days in the zoo. When I showed up at the EOC, there were 2 things I was in charge of. One of them said men's, and the other one said Diet Coke. I allowed my staff to do the job they were trained to do, whether it's law enforcement, public works, whatever the case may be. My job was to coordinate that ring circus so that we got something out of it on the end. We minimized the amount of damage, we protected property, and we saved lives. I wasn't going out and show people how to sandbag. That's public works job. My job was to make sure they had the sand, they had the sandbags, and we told them where they needed to sandbag. And so you can see with the various components that comprise your little circus, you need to be familiar with these folks when they come to your EOC, they come to your scene, and know how to function with them. You know, we have all these newest technologies of Twitter and Tweeter and Instagram and Facebook, and they're, you know, those are all great. But I came up in the business when you sat across the table and looked at somebody and you had a discussion about what you would do and what I would do should we have that event. There's a lot to be said about the conferences that you and I attend, the training of getting to know people. I once was told when I first got my job as emergency manager by, at that time, and this will date me, at Mountain Fuel, you need to sit across the table so I know who you are, because if you call and ask for something in a disaster and I don't know you, you go on the list of everybody else. I had a former director of, I don't remember if it was Comprehensive Emergency Management, Homeland Security, Emergency Management, one of those acronyms that went along. She told me the time to change business cards is now, today, not when the disaster's ongoing. You need to know who those players are, because if you don't, you will go wanting. 2005, Brigham City experienced a flood, warm rain on a snowpack. Before I like to say before the media got there, I had 6 phone calls from friends of mine, emergency managers in other disciplines in northern Utah, and their response to me was, what do you need, when do you want it, and you will have it. I didn't have to ask. That's how we should function as a group, because I think all of you that have been in the business at whatever level, whether it's private sector, public sector, you don't have enough resources. And if you do, would you write a book, because you can retire? We need to utilize that networking. Working with the state, and some of you may not know this, there is a handbook out there on what you should do as an emergency manager. Kimberly Giles from Region 1 has been tasked or volunteered. I'm not sure what happened with Kimberly, but her goal is to update this book to make it a usable tool to go in our toolbox or your toolbox, so that when that event happens, you can pull that book out. Will and I would like to hope that that book, the Emergency Manager's Handbook that you see there, can become a textbook for what he and I are proposing to the state, that as we roll this out, that is the textbook. The information in there we can share, because we have a lot of new folks coming in, and I used to get phone calls from folks that, Jim, I was just appointed the emergency manager. I don't know where to start. I can spell it, but I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. Where do I start? And we're hoping between the two of these, between UEMA and the state of Utah, we can put together a program to roll it out to answer some of those questions as to where do we go. And I believe, Chris, this is online, that you can access it now, and it's not updated form, and Kimberly's working on it, and I promise to give you the pieces that you need from me. So I haven't forgotten. How many of you have task books, task sheets, that when that disaster happens, you can look at it and go, what do I do first? What do I do second? What do I do third? If you don't have, you need to have one or invent one. Because it can be a case that people show up at your EOC, they're probably in a position that they normally don't occupy. And if you went up and asked them their name, they probably can't tell you. It may even be as simple as showing them how to plug in the phone into the little plug and what their phone number is. What decisions do I need to make? Who do I need to notify? If you work under a mayor and the mayor wants to know everything going on, when do you notify the mayor? I can tell you that if you don't notify the mayor and he or she finds it on Facebook or wherever else, you can bet you'll have a trip to the boss's office. What information do you provide to your counterparts at a county level if you're a city, or to a state level, and when do you provide that information? We work at providing information on an on a recurring basis because we want to be familiar with it. And like I said, unfortunately, unless you're in a part of the state of Utah that I'm not familiar with, we don't have these events often enough that we get proficient. We unfortunately, because of the climate conditions, seem to be having more and more wildfires. And wildfires, we have found, will follow up the following fall or even into spring with flooding because we've lost the vegetation. But if we took away those two components, we don't have a lot, and we don't, I'm not advocating that we have a lot, but we need to become proficient at it. And by establishing those job aids or task decisions, we put those training wheels on your bike so you don't tip off. Because if you tip off, as my good friend in the back of the room told me back, I won't tell him how long ago because he was only a kid when he told me, if you screw up, you don't get the second chance. They'll find somebody else. And that's true. And we've seen that happen, unfortunately. It also helps you provide some personal goals that you can set out. What do I need to do? Because I can tell you, having been through 2 presidential declarations, it's not funny when you're sitting there and 1,000 things are racing through your mind and you can't grasp anything. It's a thought here, then it's over there, then it's over here. Having those decision sheets, job aids, task books make it a lot easier to come up with solving those problems. I can tell you that if you don't get ahead of the disaster, in the very beginning, the disaster will keep ahead of you until the very end. And unfortunately, as Will alluded to with the fire service, if firefighters do not put water on the fire, it'll eventually burn itself out. If you don't take care of a flooding problem with sandbags, evacuation, the flood will eventually quit. Water will run out. And then you have to deal with extensive damage. I believe it's in your packet. If it isn't, will be when we roll this out. It's a decision. Do I go to the scene? What is my role? And this again depends upon the organization you function under. If your boss wants you to go to the EOC only, that's where you go. But you do have options in some places where you may go to the scene. And are there things that you can bring to that incident commander to allow them to do their job? You're not taking over, you're providing a resource to them. Or do I go to the EOC? What's my scene size up? What's the situational awareness? Where are we at? What are the potentials that exist in the next 10 minutes, the next hour, the next 2 hours, the next 20 hours? What happens at the end of the week? Those are things that you need to be able to have some kind of a reference to, and by having a basic choice checklist, you can do it. But in that situational awareness, where do I fit the best? Do I fit best in an EOC where it's warm and you don't get wet? Or do I do better if I'm out in the field providing those resources? You have to make that decision based upon your organization. Do I play a role as the incident commander? Or has that been determined in your comprehensive emergency plan that the incident commander's role will be filled by fire, law enforcement, public works, however you have it set up within your organization? Or do I perform other roles in order to be a better emergency manager and to be able to coordinate my circus that I now have going within my community? Those are decisions you have to make. And by making those decisions ahead of time, you and your boss or bosses remove one of those criteria that you have to think of at the time of the disaster. Under the incident command system, you're all familiar with this. If you've taken NIMS, I'm not going to bore you with it. You all know how it works. Will it work in your community? Will it work in your EOC? Or do you have a better way of doing it? If you don't have a better way of doing it, then you should climb on this bandwagon. Because when the counties or the states, the universities open up their EOCs, you need to know where you fit and how does your organization fit. I see we're eventually going to be making transition. Back in the day, it used to be very easy. I'd call up and say, I need a pump or I need a generator. And I told them what I wanted and they sent it. We seem to be moving away from that and going into missions. What are you going to do with that pump? And you let us provide you with the tools you need to do the job. So we need to get on that page to be mission sensitive to the things that we're going to do. And I believe that's...
Yeah, probably one of the tougher arguments that we've heard out there, or how I want to say it, one of the issues that has come up as emergency managers have voiced their opinion is, what is my role? When we take a NIMS class or we take ICS, have you ever seen the little box that has the emergency manager's name in it? It's not in there. It's not a standard position, but yet the role or the function is vital. How often is the EOC brought into play? How many of you have opened up your EOC in a disaster in the last year? How many opened up your EOC in a disaster in the last 2 years? How many have opened up your EOC in a disaster in the last 3 years? How many have ever opened up your EOC in a real disaster? So, as an emergency manager then, when do you bring in that EOC piece? As you've had a chance to go through the emergency management classes from FEMA, they've usually taught you all the parts and the pieces of the EOC. But has anybody ever taught you or helped you figure out that it's not an all or none? It can be opened in parts and pieces. It is a tool, just like all the other tools in your toolbox. There's a proper place and a proper way to pull the tool out of the toolbox. And it doesn't have to be an all or none. In fact, the other thing we hear from a lot of small jurisdictions is, I can't even begin to do an EOC because I don't have the staff or the people to make the EOC work. It's true, every time you, and Jim has taught this well over the years, every time you create a box, that means that has to be a person or a function, right? And in many small jurisdictions, they don't even have the people to do the field work, let alone to have a 30 or 40 person emergency operations center. So what do? Well, hopefully, same thing. We'll think about some options and different ways that we can pull that tool out of the toolbox, because it does indeed have a role. As an emergency manager, once more, rather than having the fight with the incident commander on the scene, especially on a disaster scene that the incident commander is very capable of already handling, why not perform the emergency manager role as well as bring tools to that disaster that would help the situation? For example, I'm going to go back to the fire service. Jim and I know fire service more than anything else, and Chief Ward, I'm going to give you a scenario. Chief Ward is fighting a commercial structure fire in Layton City, and I arrive on scene as the Layton City emergency manager. As the emergency manager, am I going to be able to be a better incident commander than Chief Ward? No. There is not a tool that I have in my box that's Chief Ward is one of the best firefighters I know and runs a good ship there in Layton. But there isn't a tool in my emergency management box that he doesn't already have, or in the fire service already be trying to employ if it was appropriate. But if I walked into that incident command post and I said, Chief Ward, as the emergency manager, I am here to help. One, I would ask, are there things that I can take off your shoulders to help this situation? As an emergency manager, what do I have in my toolbox that I could bring to this situation? Let's think about that. As an emergency manager, what is in your toolbox? Our front cover has a toolbox on it. What I want you to do is think of it. You're an emergency manager, right? What are your tools? A firefighter has hoses, big red fire trucks, axes, shovels. Police officer has tasers, handcuffs, the jail, everything else that goes along with law enforcement. What are the tools of the local emergency manager? Okay, people, laptops, okay, relationships, okay. We need to, as emergency managers, be able to identify what are the tools in our toolbox that makes us a little bit different than the fire chief, the police chief, or the public works director. And we need to know what we can bring to that situation that'll make it better. What do I have as an emergency manager? Hopefully one of my primary tools is the emergency operations plan with all its various annexes and parts and pieces. In this situation, if the fire was close to a neighborhood, one of the strategies that Chief Ward might employ is shelter in place or evacuate. Who knows the evacuation plan? The emergency manager, right? Most of the time you've either written it or rewritten it or taught it to the people, correct? Is there somebody who could now take off the shoulders of that incident commander? What are we going to do with the people? If I were to turn to Chief Ward and say, hey, if and when you're ready to evacuate the neighborhood or we need to shelter in place, I can activate the plan and I can take that load off his shoulders. He can turn his attention back to the fire, the strategy in controlling the fire, but I can take that piece off his shoulders. Whether it's an evacuation of the community in a wildland fire, or whether it's sheltering them at the local shelter in conjunction with the Red Cross, or putting out the emergency alert to tell the people. There's another tool in our toolbox. You know, Once more, the incident commander can stay in the heat of the battle, and we can start taking assignments off his shoulders to help the situation. And if we perform well, what are our chances of getting invited back to the next structure fire? Think Chief Ward would love to have us come back? Yeah. Okay. So what's our primary goal as an emergency manager? Not to fight the fire, not to take out the active shooter, but to take care of the people. Utilizing our plans, our relationships, and the things that are in our realm of control, we can become an important player to make that situation better. We just need to have the opportunity to explore what those are and become proficient at doing that. So yeah, what are our tools? Knowledge, skills, and abilities. We need to define those, put those in your toolbox. Once more, priorities will always be the same whether you're the incident commander or whether you're the emergency manager. Priorities never change. What are they? Life safety, incident stabilization, and property protection. Okay? Our priorities aren't any different than the incident commanders, but our tools might be a little different. We do bring our own set of tools. We do have a role to play, and knowing how to play that role and what tools we bring to the situation make all the difference in the world. Okay, yeah, we have plans. How many different plans do you have as an emergency manager? I can think of 5 main plans that an emergency manager has. What are they? Emergency operation. Okay, we have an operations plan or a response plan. Yeah, what else? COOP plan, yep. Continuity operations. What else? Recovery plan, yep. Mitigation, yep. And hopefully you're working on your critical infrastructure plan, okay? Five main sets, 5 main tools. As an emergency manager, are you versed in those tools? And do you know when and how to apply those tools at the proper place and time? Or particular, what annex would you pull out of the operations plan to apply to this particular disaster? Okay, relationships. Yep, you've got more contacts with more agencies out there than you can shake a stick at, and hopefully you'll bring those with you when you come to that incident command post or you open up that EOC. Once more tools that you can pull out and use at the right place and the right time. Get up here to hit the right button. Which tool do you pull out of the toolbox first? If we could start once more putting emergency manager classes together to give you the hands-on skills and practice with that in the fire service. Once more, I'm going to return back to Chief Ward here because he has been a great instigator of this in the state of Utah. Our friends in the fire service have what's called a command training center where they train fire ground commanders. Once more, they realize something that we need to learn in emergency management. Your first disaster should not be your first disaster. In other words, learning by the seat of your pants is not the best way to learn. If you could, prior to that, go through all the thought processes and fine-tune proper actions before you actually got into either the command seat or the emergency manager seat, how much better would that be? I want you to think about this question. How did you become a good emergency manager? Where did you learn the tools of the trade? As I ask that question to emergency managers around this state, you know what they tell me? The school of hard knocks. Yep. Let me ask you this, as a profession, is that the way we want to learn? I think as a profession we can do a whole lot better. I'm not saying that that's not a good teacher. but there are better ways to teach. A command training center or emergency managers training center is once more a much better idea than trying to figure it out at 1 o'clock in the morning at your very first disaster. Because we all know the last place you want to be is in the heart of the snake. I apologize, Jim, I've gotten off our thing, but hopefully, as we've presented these things to you, a couple things are starting to take shape, and that is the ability that you have as an emergency manager, one, to learn some very important skills, two, know how to apply those skills and equipment and actions at the right place at the right time. Without that, once more, a lot of times people aren't going to want us around, and we are only going to make the situation worse. Our goal is to work with the state to develop opportunities to do just that.
So what are some decisions that you need to make? You talked about your plans that you have. Do you activate your plan? Do you activate part of your plan? Do you activate it in an EOC? Do you activate it at the side of a road? You have to make that decision. And we're hoping by putting this program together and giving a series of scenarios that you will work through as part of this program, you will get comfortable in making those decisions without having to go through the school of hard knocks. Not taking away from the school of hard knocks. There's a lot to be learned from that school. But it can be a lot less painful if you've got some institutional knowledge stored to avoid some of the lumps that come along with the school of hard knocks. How do you coordinate and collaborate with your partners in emergency management? When do you let the state of Utah know, and what information do they need to know, and when they need to know it? And this has become even more critical now with all of the social media out there. It's quicker to find out what's going on in a community on Facebook than it probably is by calling the emergency manager of Brigham City, Box Elder County in the state of Utah. But is it factual? So it's critical that you know how this process works, and when do you issue that declaration? How many of you have ever written up and issued a declaration? A couple. Do you know the process? Do you know the wording that needs to be in there, wording that doesn't need to be in there? How do you push it through the various levels of government? Those are things that we're hoping we can build into this course to actually give you an opportunity to issue a declaration and move it through the various steps. How many of you know how to activate statewide mutual aid? A couple of you are shaking your heads. Some are going, I don't know if I want to say or not. Those are things that we need to make sure you understand how to do it. Because at 2:30 in the morning, calling Kimberly Giles from Region 1 and asking her how to do all this may take her a while to get to where you're at to give you those answers. And we want to give you an opportunity to work through a case where people don't get hurt, people don't die, and you go home dry and be able to take care of addressing those issues. How many of you have ever had an opportunity to implement a preliminary damage assessment or even know what it is? If you have a disaster, you will learn rather rapidly what it is and how do you go about conducting it. Because one of the things that Director Hamlet and his people are going to want to know is how much dollars have you lost? What critical infrastructure is no longer workable? To the residents of Brigham City, all 19,000 rely on being able to go in the smallest room in their house, push the little handle, and everything is taken care of. Well, if they can't do that, they want to know when can they? And so you need to be able to know that. When do you get information out there? Who puts it out there? Do you have 4 or 5 people releasing information? Because if you do, I can guarantee you, you will not get 4 or 5. You will get 4 or 5 different stories. You will not get the same. So how do you coordinate that information? How do you reach out, especially small communities that barely have components to fill sandbags to fight the fire? Where do you find resources to open your EOC? There are currently, I think, 3, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, 3 IMT teams that are functioning in the state of Utah that can come and provide those resources to take some of that burden and that worry off of you as you move through your disaster? How do you work with volunteers, organization active in disasters? Do you know how to get a hold of them? Do you know what their role is? Do you know the state has a plan that addresses those needs? If you don't, contact Susan Thomas and she'll tell you all about it. When do you need your EOC? Do you have to open an EOC for every event? Do you have to fully staff it? Jackie, do you open your EOC for every event? Do you staff it full-time with everybody? Can you do a partial implementation? Okay. How do you work that in yours? When there's multiple scenes, do you open an EOC so you can coordinate the activities that's going on in various parts of your community? And how do you coordinate those various activities that are going on? And how do you determine what material goes where and who gets it? Nothing like having a fire chief and a police chief fight over resources. What are your options for activation? Some of you, how many of you set up your EOC or your emergency plan under the emergency support functions? How many of you use something different? You need to come up with however works for you, but you need to come up with some way of doing it. This is the way that the federal government has released it. Keeping an EOC management function simple. It's like looking for the needle in the haystack. But now's the time to do it, today, not tomorrow or not in the midst of a disaster. It's today when you can clearly think, you can bring in your staff, and you can come up with those kind of decisions. It's the pillars, it's the resources, it's the planning. It's to be able to provide information. And what's the situation? It'll change rapidly. Really rapidly. Geez, I thought they used shepherd hooks to just pull you off when it's on time. One of the goals in an EOC is to maximize your resources. You only have so many resources. Where do they go? Who gets them? Consolidate, control. Reduce communications overload by keeping everybody informed. Provide accountability and reduce self-assignments. Keep calm, read job aids. Job aid I had in Brigham City's EOC was each position had a notebook, and in that notebook it told them, one, what their name was, what their phone number was, showed a picture how to hook up the telephone into the wall, told them what their phone number was, because I found in my first flooding, when they were confronted, they were challenged, remembering their own name. I have been in a position where I couldn't tell you whether I was coming or I was going. And that'll happen to you. How we want to evaluate, where are we at? Where are you at? Are you doing a great job? What's the excess purpose of the response effort? Are we making progress in reducing the amount of damage? Benchmarks. Are there benchmarks? Fire service has benchmarks. Law enforcement has benchmarks. Do we in emergency management have benchmarks? If we don't, we should. So we can evaluate, where are we at? What are we doing? Where are we going? Disaster guidelines. We need to know what those are. Social media posts, they'll keep us on our feet. Trouble with some of them, you have to spend how much time retracting what's been said, because it's not necessarily the truth. Coordinate and collaborate. If you don't know who your partners are above you or below you, you should. Because those are the ones who are going to help save your bacon. Because without them, you can't do it by yourself. Initiate a disaster declaration.
Yeah, once more, nothing worse than trying to figure out the paperwork in the heat of the disaster. If we had the opportunity and could choose to do so, sure be nice to have it practiced before. Same thing, we often think, well, we'll get it with the next disaster exercise. How often do you exercise? As an emergency manager, how often in an exercise do you ever get to exercise your emergency management position? Most of the time when we exercise, what's the emergency manager doing? He's either evaluating or doing what? Running the exercise, right? So let me ask you this question. In your next emergency exercise, or could you exercise your emergency management position and its functions prior to a disaster? Wouldn't that be much better than figuring out in the middle of the disaster? It'd be nice. And once more, with the Emergency Managers Training Center concept, we hope to be able to do that, give you the opportunity to fill out the papers. You know, what about the statewide Mutual Aid Act? It's been out a little bit, and liaisons have come around, and we've seen the paperwork. How many have ever filled out and officially requested or activated statewide mutual aid? So in the next disaster, what's going to happen when you need to activate it? Wouldn't it be nice to practice activating it before, so that it'd be a much better experience in the middle of the disaster? Yeah, we hope so. You know, there are a lot of tools in that emergency manager's toolbox. You know, this is another one too. Initiate a pre-disaster assessment, preliminary assessment. Wouldn't it be nice, as good as Kimberly and the rest of the liaisons are, they would probably appreciate it if we knew how to do it on our own without having to be held by the hand and walk through doing it. So, you know, a lot of tools out there. As emergency managers, we need to get the toolbox out, identify the tools, and become familiar with them. Now, hopefully in public information, once more, we've got PIOs, they're doing the same thing. They're coming up to speed. But as an emergency manager, yep, there are tools we need to do as well. And certainly, last but not least, once more, being able to interact and work with an incident management team. There are tools or tricks to the trade we need to know and understand. And then certainly, last but not least, practice. Good practice does prevent piss poor performance. If you perfect practice, makes perfect performance, right? And that's our goal with the Emergency Managers Training Center. We don't envision high technology. It'll probably be there down the road, but initially, a simple classroom with paperwork and opportunities to practice the roles and the interactions is what we're looking at. We hope that the first time somebody comes running up to you and say, hey, we've got one of these happening in our town, it will not be a disaster and you will not make it worse. We hope that the first time you encounter one, you'll say, I remember what I'm supposed to do. I know what tool to pull out of the box. I know how to be useful on scene, or I know which parts of the EOC to get up and get functioning. That is the goal behind the initiative. Thank you for keeping us on the straight and narrow, Jackie. Our time has come to an end. We appreciate you and all you've done. I'm going to give the mic to my cohort for the final words.
We hope in this hour we've kind of shown you the program we're trying to put together, and we need your input. Those of you that are out there practicing in the field, what would you like to see added to this? Is there something in there we put in that you would like to remove from there? Because we really feel that we need to help develop that toolbox, to put tools in your toolbox so you can all function if and when that disaster happens. And if this is successful, Will and I would like to move then on to the next one of developing one for recovery, for mitigation, and for prevention, so that we can hopefully provide tools in that toolbox that you now are packing around, that you will be able to, whatever the situation is, be able to function without having that senior moment, and some of you haven't reached that senior moment that I can use for an excuse, that you'll know what toolbox to pull out. You'll know which tool to pull out, and you'll know what to use. You know, I'm farthest from the greatest mechanic. A wrench is a wrench, and there's a wrench that fits one thing and a wrench fits another. And for me, as long as it does what I want it to do, I'm good, even though it may not be the most efficient. So if there's suggestions, would you let either Will or I or Chris know what you would like to see added, subtracted, whatever, if we're on the right track. If we're not on the right track and we're going down the road, nobody wants to go with us, then we'll go a different direction. But we think between the state's handbook and programs like this, we can help you build a toolbox that will make it better for you when that phone call comes and tells you you have a problem. We appreciate your attendance. I know it's late in the afternoon. Usually by now most people have gone home, so thank you for staying and paying attention. And if there's any questions, you can catch us afterwards, because Jackie looks like she's going to rip this out of my hand, so I'm going to give it to her before.
Okay, well, Jim and Will, thank you so much, and let's give them all a hand.